And now we'll turn our attention to our featured presentation that goes along with our exhibition, Love Stories from the National Portrait Gallery. I'd like to welcome our two speakers. We have Cassandra Albinson and Lucy Peltz, who will be in conversation about portraiture and about our current exhibition, Love Stories from the National Portrait Gallery, London. Dr. Cassandra Albinson is head of the Division of European and American Art and the Margaret S. Winthrop Curator of American Art at the Harvard Art Museums. Her long title led to some confusion online in some of our marketing materials, and she would like me to clarify that she is just one person and not two people. So she will be presenting as herself tonight. Dr. Albinson's love of museums really started as she was visiting a Victorian house museum with her mother, an architect, and she glimpsed a member of the staff open a small door under the stairs and disappear below. With her interest piqued, she then studied art history courses at Washington University in her native St. Louis and pursued her studies at Wellesley College and Yale University. Now at the Harvard Art Museum, she aims to ignite the interest of young visitors. Her specialty is portraits of aristocratic women in 19th century Britain and France. We're excited to have her join us tonight to help us think about portraiture in new ways. Dr. Lucy Peltz is the head of collection displays, Tudor to Regency, and senior curator of 18th century collections at the National Portrait Gallery, London. She studied history of art and French at Sussex University before taking her master's in the history of art at the Courtauld Institute of Art and completed her Ph.D. at the University of Manchester. She worked as an assistant curator and curator at the British Museum and the Museum of London before joining the National Portrait Gallery as 18th century curator in 2001. Since then, she's been responsible for refurbishing and redisplaying the Regency galleries, as well as for developing Making Faces, 18th century style at Benningborough Hall, a series of interactive galleries which use portraiture, hands-on exhibits, and digital material to explore portraiture as a business in the 18th century. She was the curator of the exhibition now at the Worcester Art Museum, Love Stories from the National Portrait Gallery. At the end of tonight's presentation, we'll also hear from Olivia Stone, WAM's curatorial assistant, who researched and chose the Valentines from the Worcester Historical Museum's collection that are currently on display in this exhibition. Now I'll turn the reins of the conversation over to Cassandra and Lucy. So please unmute yourselves and you'll be ready.
Hi, so I'm Lucy and I'm going to kick off this evening talk a little bit about the National Portrait Gallery and some of my recent projects at the National Portrait Gallery that give you a little bit of an idea of how our art gallery and museum has its rather unique tack through the sector. So, and also to say how delighted I am to be here. Thank you, Eileen, for such a rousing introduction. And also to say that I'm delighted to reunite with Cassandra, who I see occasionally, not recently because of COVID, of course, but we curated the Thomas Lawrence exhibition that some of you might have seen at the British Arts Centre in 2010. It was also on display in London in that period. So it was a pretty special opportunity to revisit the work of an artist that's pretty special for both Cassandra and me, but also we found for many people out there in the public. So that was a fantastic experience. Back at the National Portrait Gallery, this is a particularly exciting and busy time due to the fact that we are currently closed for a refurbishment and the entire redisplay of the collection, which will be the first time ever that the collection from the Tudor period to the present day has been rehung and newly interpreted for the first time. So it will be a completely coherent, consistent, I hope, hang across 42 galleries. This leads to the reason why I'm here today, and that we have timed this event also, as you won't have missed, to the week of Valentine's Day. And that's obviously, Eileen mentioned, I'm the curator of the Love Stories exhibition, which is currently on at WAM, Love Stories from the National Portrait Gallery, and that is on until the 13th of March, so we're into our last month. To start this evening, Eileen suggested I'd say a bit about the National Portrait Gallery. So many of you will be familiar with the idea of a dedicated portrait gallery from the one in Washington, D.C., which is part of the Smithsonian Group. There are other portrait galleries in Australia, Canada, Scotland, and a couple of Scandinavian countries, but the National Portrait Gallery in London was the first of these to be established. We were founded in 1856 as a publicly funded free art gallery as part of that 19th century drive for self-improvement and the conscious construction of a metrocentric national identity at a time when Britain and its empire were undergoing a radical increase in size, influence, and wealth. The gallery's founding fathers, I'm getting some feedback. Maybe someone's got their mic on. The gallery's founding fathers, Lord Stanhope and the historian Thomas Carlyle, argued in Parliament for the civilizing mission of a collection which would, and I quote, administer gratification and delight to all classes, descending even to the lowest, end quote, and that the collection should be composed of, quote, portraits of the most eminent persons in British history that would materially illustrate the history of the nation, end quote. What makes my work as a curator a little different from that of, say, Cassandra's here on the virtual podium, who is responsible for European and American art, I thought it was European art at Harvard Museums, is that on considering a portrait, my first question is, who does it show? Are we sure? And what did they do of importance? In short, the subject of the portrait claims prime position at the National Portrait Gallery, over the artist, certainly, and sometimes even over the composition and quality, as you'll see in a moment. Great advert. This makes the National Portrait Gallery unusual, as it's partly an art gallery and partly a museum, although it looks like an art gallery. This duality or split personality is encoded in our modern mission statement, which states that we, one, exist to promote through the medium of portraits the appreciation and understanding of the men and women who have made and are making British history and culture, and two, to promote the appreciation and understanding of portraiture in all media. In 2022, the gallery has the largest and most prestigious collection of portraits in the world, including paintings, sculpture, miniatures, drawings, prints, and photographs. It contains about 12,500 portraits of the most famous and influential people in British history, as well as a reference collection of nearly 2 million objects. From the only authentic portrait of Shakespeare to self-portraits of Hockney and Freud, rare literary portraits like Jane Austen, leaders like Churchill or Thatcher, and many interesting celebrities, inventors, legislators, and campaigners, and all sorts of other people in between. And nowadays, we work hard to increase the inclusivity and diversity of both the historical and contemporary collections. To give a brief overview, I put together this somewhat arbitrary selection, which I'll introduce from the bottom left, if I can find the laser pen, there you go. From the bottom left, I'm sure you'll recognize Joan Collins, one of Warhol's.
Lucy, you need to move to your first slide. You're on the Wallace slide.
I'm on the Wallace slide? Yes. This is the introduction?
We're seeing the Duchess of Windsor and John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So I don't know if we're, which is very nice, but.
I'm so sorry, you've had a full face. That's curious, because that's not what I'm looking at.
We're seeing a black screen.
And some people are seeing a blank screen. Okay.
Blank, yeah.
Let me try sharing again.
Okay.
Let me resume share. Now, what are you looking at now?
Now you're at your first slide again, Lucy.
Okay,
yes,
sorry
now
about
it looks
that.
Good.
That must have been quite a shock. Okay, right. So I was going to give you this brief introduction to the collection. Joan Collins, as you'll recognize, by Warhol from about 1985. Then above her, I've got to get to my list, is Lytton Strachey, the Bloomsbury Circle writer by his lover, Dora Carrington. And this is one of the paintings in Love Stories. Then we have Mary Seacole, the nurse from the Crimean War, by Albert Charles Channon of 1869. Bloodhead, a self-portrait by British artist Mark Quinn, cast with his own blood in 2006 and regularly topped up, my contemporary curators tell me. One of Lucian Freud's many self-portraits, although the only one we own. Ditto one of many portraits of Queen Elizabeth II. This one, a wonderful portrait with her eyes closed mid-shoot, mounted on it's a lenticular print mounted on a light box. It's extremely fascinating and intriguing with its luminescence. Then we have Ayuba Suleiman Diallo by William Hoare of Bath, which is the first portrait of a freed slave in British art history from 1733. John Lennon in the buff once again. He actually never wears clothes. It's a little known secret. That famous poignant last kiss taken on the afternoon that he was shot by Annie Leibovitz for Rolling Stone. G.F. Watts's Choosing, which Cassandra is going to talk about a bit in a moment. And then a portrait I suspect a lot of you recognize, one of our absolute icons, Queen Elizabeth I by Marcus Garretts, and she's standing on the map of Britain in this wonderful composition. And here, from our architect's presentation, the north facade of the National Portrait Gallery looking up Charing Cross Road, for those of you who know London, with its new entrance, which is one of the things that we are creating. New entrance and a wonderful new public piazza in a gathering space, a small gathering space in the city, which is a nice addition. And I was going to say something about how the collection is formed. Take, for example, this iconic painting. It's not very good and it's in a bit of a state, but our visitors are wowed by it. Why? It has a kind of aura. It's the only portrait of the Bronte sisters and includes two of the 19th century's most celebrated authors, namely Emily Bronte on the extreme left, author of Wuthering Heights in 1847, and Charlotte Bronte, author of Jane Eyre, also in 1847, on the extreme right as we look at the portrait. A collection of British worthies might be unthinkable without the Brontes, but few of our works are in quite such a state, so I should explain. The appearance of this work surprises us, not just because of the damage, but also because of the amateur way that it's been painted and the derisory way it's clearly been treated after that. It was made by Branwell Bronte, the oldest sibling, who at some point painted himself out of this group composition, rather roughly here, this act of editing. And the original presence of Branwell has begun to ghost through as the paint layer has become transparent with age. It wasn't recognized until the 1950s that he was actually originally under that. It was supposed to look, I think, like a column. The signs of damage not usually left visible on a collection item are the result of the painting having been shoved on top of a cupboard for over 50 years, before it came into the collection, I should add. This was presumably because Branwell and the family didn't rate it. But as the only portrait of the Bronte sisters together, it's of paramount importance to the MPG, and the gallery decided to acquire it in the early 20th century, almost as soon as it was rediscovered. Although unusual, it was decided to keep evidence of its many years folded up, forgotten and unloved, to reflect how the Brontes' writing was not appreciated in their own lifetimes, and also to record the romantic story of the rediscovery of this rare likeness of such important sitters. The issue of likeness is fundamental to the foundational idea of the gallery. The historian Thomas Carlyle, who I mentioned before and was the principal advocate for the gallery's inception, is famous for a series of lectures on heroes and for his evocative comment, and I quote, "Often I have found a portrait superior in real instruction to half a dozen written biographies. A portrait is a small lighted candle by which the biographies could for the first time be read and some human interpretation be made of them." This led to the founding principle that portraits should be taken from the life. And while we have become rather blasé about likeness in this age of the mass and immediate production of portraiture through analog and especially digital photography, the idea of the interaction between the artist and the sitter remains seminal in all but the most contemporary acquisitions, where the use of photography in composition is common. While we still try to find likenesses of sitters made during their lifetime, unless sorry, I've lost my place. What has evolved is the breadth and inclusivity of curators' acquisitions as they consider sufficiently eligible to present to our trustee board a much wider range of sitters, which is what we call people in portraits, than has ever been the case before. The first thing to say is that until the last few decades, the gallery's collecting policy, a sitter not only had to have been dead for 10 years before the gallery considered acquiring them, a kind of reputational cooling off period, but that a sitter should have made a contribution to British history. This didn't provide room for many historical female sitters who, unless members of the royal family, were more or less actively excluded from participating in public life or making a mark on British history. That is, if we remember that women were forbidden from acting on the public stage until the 1660s and had few publishing opportunities until the trade was deregulated, so to speak, in the 18th century. Then there's the question of what it means to make a contribution. This is something we've opened up really widely in the last 20 years to be inclusive. So, for example, a new openness to achievement made in a local or more specific community-based setting. These last criteria have provided opportunities to acquire more women and sitters from a wider range of backgrounds. Here are two examples that have occupied me during the last year or so. On the left, a modest miniature of Ignatius Sancho, which is by an unknown artist after the full-size oil painting by Thomas Gainsborough, which has been in the National Gallery in Ottawa since the 1950s. Apart from the two black and white engravings, we had no way of representing Sancho, who is important to our story because though born a slave in Grenada, he was brought to Britain as a child, educated by his first owners, and eventually ended up working as a butler for the Earl of Montague. This aristocrat developed such a fond relationship with Sancho that he left him an inheritance to buy himself freedom and enough to acquire a grocer's shop in London. Sancho became a society figure and eventually earned enough to become the first person of colour to have the vote in Britain, a status then based on unearned income. Sancho also made a mark as an author, musician, and writer of abolitionist tracts. When this miniature came to auction, we were confident that this would be the last occasion we would have to acquire a portrait of him. Even though it's a copy of a now well-known Gainsborough, our response was to Sancho's importance, something actually reflected by the production of this copy in his own time. As an aside, the reason we could afford this miniature on ivory is that the EU and America have now banned the importation of ivory, meaning that the bottom has dropped out of the miniature market and presumably the movement of all other ivory antiques. On the right, another similar story of rags to riches, but perhaps not riches in this case, this time based upon our own rediscovery and research. A watercolor self-portrait of Sarah Biffin, the daughter of a poor cobbler who had a difficult life, but still managed to have a professional career as a painter of miniatures, despite having phocomelia, making her differently abled with no arms and legs. You can just see her paintbrush, which is supposed to appear attached to her sleeve, although we actually know that she used her mouth to paint miniatures. Her success, as her genteel costume indicates, is made even more impressive, given that she started out as a 13-year-old, working for a traveling showman as billed the greatest wonder in the world, producing miniatures on ivory for 3 to 10 guineas each. Leaving you to think that I only collect portraits done in oval, I thought I'd show you another recent project. This is the gallery's favorite type of acquisition, when all the stars are aligned. Not just a work of historical and cultural significance of a person not already in the collection, but a fantastic work of art. In this instance, we're looking at Thomas Gainsborough's light and vibrant portrait of the French dancer Gaëtan Vestris, who introduced ballet into Britain in the 1780s during a relatively short residence in the country. This painting hasn't been seen in public since the start of the 20th century, and it was also offered to the gallery as a gift in lieu of taxes from the estate of its owner, so a coup on all fronts. This great portrait of a French man in Britain is the moment I hand over to Cassandra from Harvard, so that she can say something about portraiture tends to register in her work.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That was really great to hear, and I look forward to asking you some other questions about the exhibition Love Stories and about your work on portraiture as well. As Eileen said when she introduced me, I'm the curator of European art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I have specialized in my career in portraiture from the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain and France. So just wanted to talk with you about a few projects that I'm working on right now. One is related to Harvard's portrait by Francois Boucher of Madame de Pompadour at her toilette that I'm showing you here. I've been working on a book project on this portrait, and it's Boucher painting the mistress of Louis XV. And so we're going to be publishing a book this spring that looks at this really important work in Harvard's collection that came into the collections in the 1960s as a gift. And looking at it from the point of view of color, but also issues of French Empire and floriculture. You can see the flowers on the table in front of her. You can see she's applying makeup, shown with a makeup brush in her hand. But if you want to just go on to the next slide, Lucy. The focus of the painting in a lot of ways is this cameo bracelet on her wrist that is a cameo image of Louis XV, of her lover. And so I've been thinking a lot about the Boucher portrait and issues of love and romance. And so one of the things I really enjoyed in looking at the Love Stories catalog and reading more about this exhibition from the MPG was that it made me think about some of the things I've been thinking about with the portrait of Pompadour in terms of the beauty of love, but also some of the darker sides as well. Pompadour didn't marry Louis XV. She was his mistress, and taking up that position gave her a lot of power, a lot of authority in France, but it also meant that she was separated from her own child from a previous marriage, and lived a very isolated life in some ways because of that love story, and then was cast aside by the king, but remained devoted to him until the end of her life. So the exhibition has given me a lot of things to think about with this work. If you want to just go on to the next one, Lucy. It's also made me think, and I'm showing you on the right, a photograph that's in the exhibition by Patrick Litchfield, who is one of the favorite photographers of the royal family, early photographs of the Queen and her family, famous photographs of Princess Margaret in Moustique, and then was chosen to photograph the wedding of Charles and Diana. And I was fascinated to see this photograph and relate it to the painting that I'm showing you on the right, on the left, sorry. One that I've done some work on in looking at portraits of aristocratic women in Victorian Britain. And this is a portrait of Diana Spencer's great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother. And so seeing the photograph made me think about some of the things that the exhibition brings out as well in terms of portraits of couples painted together on one canvas or photographed together. As you can see, oftentimes one of the figures or both of the figures, in the case of the painted portrait on the left, is seated to keep everybody together, but also to make the size of the canvas a little bit more manageable sometimes. And makes you think about what a challenge it is for an artist to show a couple together. We'll see portraits of couples as we go through the slideshow, and also portraits of single figures, but I'm particularly interested in how love and intimacy is physically depicted in double portraits. So if you want to go on to the next one. Worcester happens to have a really interesting example of this that you can see in the galleries. This is a painting by Thomas Lawrence, the artist that Lucy and I worked on, who was president of the Royal Academy, the most important portrait painter of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Britain. And I believe this is the only double portrait of a couple that he did. He did do some groups of male figures or lots of women with children, but it's very interesting that you have this in your collection. And if you just want to go on to the next slide, Lucy. This is a painting that is in the exhibition in Love Stories that you can see, that's traveled from the National Portrait Gallery. This amazing painting by Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president of the Royal Academy, very, very important portrait painter. Often wrote about wanting to paint portraits of people in sort of quasi-antique dress, because he was quite concerned about how fashionable dress can go out of fashion so quickly, and what does that mean for portraiture? But here he's done us a huge favor, I think, and painted Garrick, who was the most famous actor of his day, and his wife, Ava Maria Garrick, in very contemporary clothing, this wonderful red velvet suit that Garrick is wearing, and his wife in this beautiful white dress. And this painting is fascinating to me because it shows, the two figures together, seated, interacting. One, the wife looking off more into the distance, Garrick sort of seeming to try to get her attention. He must have been able to get her attention very easily because he was an extremely dramatic person. But I sort of love this sort of contrast between their moods, and also the way that color-wise, this very bright red and then the white dress. So I'm gonna now ask Lucy a couple of questions about the exhibition. So I hope looking at this Reynolds, which you can come and see at WAM, is a good segue to that. So Lucy, can you tell us a little bit about what the exhibition Love Stories, Art, Passion, and Tragedy is about?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think WAM is using the title Love Stories from the National Portrait Gallery, London.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No, it's okay. The book has a slightly different title.
Yeah.
And there is a book with the exhibition, ladies and gentlemen, if you find the themes we're talking about today interesting.
It's a beautiful
artfully
book.
modeled by my companion.
Beautiful book.
And
Yeah, it's really
thank
nice.
you. We enjoyed working on it. All the curators contributed essays and one or two external minor celebrity authors. So that was a very enjoyable project to work on. And also to go in deeper than an exhibition allows you to on the walls. But if you ask me what the exhibition is about, well, for the first time, the single largest collection of portraits in the world has been analyzed to understand the role of love in the creation of some of the greatest works of art in the Western tradition. The exhibition argues that the idea of love and desire are critical to the development of portraiture since the genre's emergence, certainly as in easel painting, in the English Renaissance, so what I call the Tudor period, but may not always be known by the dynastic label. It sort of tends to stick. Coextensively, we learn of the role that portraits can play in encouraging, sustaining, and remembering love, whether as a love token, a marriage portrait, a portrait of a long married couple. The Garricks we're looking at had been married for 25 years when this painting was painted. And particularly in the wake of the death of one partner or of their departure, whether to war or at the end of a relationship, at a breakup, we all know the experience of a portrait defying the absence of the beloved. And in fact, I probably will misquote Eva Garrick, but she survived David Garrick, and her friends quizzed her at her quietness, and she said, a sorrow that is going to last forever need not be dramatic or loud or explosive. It's quiet and it persists in inside. And the exhibition might also have been called From Van Dyck to Freud via Joshua Reynolds, Lee Miller, or Cecil Beaton, because the gallery is closed, we have had the opportunity to share some of our greatest works of art. In fact, as the 18th century curator, I would like to argue that the Garricks are one of those greatest works of art in the collection. But we also learn about the changing face of love through 5 centuries of love portraits, real and real life love stories on which they are based. So we learn about notions of love in the Tudor period as a dangerous illness, to the idea of romance arguably as the means of finding fulfillment in life in our own times, in our Love Island Instagrammable society. So what the exhibition reveals is that love is a constant and defining element both in portraiture and in the human condition.
just to explain to our American audience, Love Island is kind of like The Bachelor. It's a very famous television show in the UK. Similar idea. Similar idea, much better title. I would say Love Island sounds a lot better.
It's
Okay,
less gender
great.
specific.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, do you think that this exhibition could only have been done, maybe not, could only have been done, or certainly is done best by a British institution? To me, having spent some years thinking about British art, thinking about portraiture, that kind of magical mix of history and celebrity and romance, I think is something that draws a lot of American tourists even to visit London. Certainly draws some of us who are interested in British art and have devoted our life to the study of it. So I just wonder if you think there's something particularly British and from the National Portrait Gallery that makes this exhibition possible.
Well, the first thing I say is, as you're describing Britain as a place to come to learn more about romance, and if only that was true. But we think of France as the place to go for romance, or Italy. Nevertheless, I think what you're making a really interesting point there, which is that the reason that the National Portrait Gallery, or let's say a National Portrait Gallery, because obviously there are a handful of others, might be able to do an exhibition like this based entirely on their own collection, is that we collect portraits of people as individuals, and then curators are in the process of proposing acquisitions, and then in the further research that goes with those acquisitions, we need to inform ourselves about the lives, activities, achievements, networks, and relationships of people. And so looking at this portrait of G.F. Watts with Ellen Terry, a pair that are in the exhibition, it was known to the 19th century curator that G.F. Watts was besotted and deeply in love with Ellen Terry, painted her many, many times. And I know you have some things to say about this as a Victorianist, but the symbolism of this portrait speaks to his love for her. It's obviously a deeply, hotly romantic painting, one of the favorite works in the collection. But what I think is interesting is that the fascination with portraiture is a particularly British state of affairs. And that was true right through the 17th and 18th century, when other countries were prioritizing history painting or biblical scenes or battle paintings. Britain was much more individualized, and the art market was much more commercial and centered around transactions with, let's say, the middling sorts, but also aristocrats who wanted their own stories and their own faces to be recorded. What Britain lacked from the Glorious Revolution onwards, being a constitutional monarchy and with a church that was Protestant and had a tradition of kind of iconoclasm and didn't use imagery in the same way that the Catholic Church is. There was neither church nor state patronage, and therefore artists had to turn to a much more commercial model to make their bread and butter. And actually there was this constant stress.
Yeah, and we'll see in a couple of slides, we'll see an image of a couple that was involved in some of the, more than just these sitters, but the two that we'll see were involved in the reform movement. And one of the things I find quite interesting, I think, obviously Britain probably still today is somewhat stratified in terms of class differences, but it was also a place in, by the time the 19th century came around, and there were changes to voting laws where you could change your position in society if you earned enough money and you got the right to vote.
As I said, with Sancho, who obviously invested wisely and had some unearned income.
Yeah, and so then there's a great need for people to physically reposition themselves, show themselves in a different light that they had been in before. And so they go to artists, and even someone like Watts, who we're seeing on the left, who you know, obviously he was very interested in mythological painting in some ways. He was a very unique kind of artist, very sort of self-driven, but even he is deeply, deeply engaged with portraiture as well, both the self-portrait that we're seeing on the left, and then this portrait of Ellen Terry, who Lucy mentioned was his wife, his very, very young wife. But, you know, he doesn't just show her as a muse, he also shows her, it's also a portrait of her. So it looks like we're seeing someone in the chat is asking to see more images. So I hear you. Should we move ahead and have a look at some other images?
Well, the thing you were just saying, Cassandra, about repositioning, I think is very interesting when looking at the portrait on the left, Venetia Lady Digby by Anthony van Dyck, which was commissioned after her death, quite young. I think she was in her late 30s. She died in bed one night without any particular prior illness. And her absolutely grief-stricken husband, Kenelm Digby, commissioned several portraits from Van Dyck, who he was close to. One of them is actually of Venetia on her deathbed with rose petals strewn around as if she was asleep. And this more mythological painting where she's trampling on winged Cupid, and the figure, I haven't got my point, oops, sorry. The figure to the left here is Two-Faced Deceit, and this is all about clearing her name, repositioning her in society, despite the fact that she's now died, in order to clear her name against slurs that attended her during the period that Kenelm had to be abroad fighting a war. And there were accusations or suggestions that she'd been unfaithful to him. And this is before they got married, but they were betrothed. And on the right, another moment of muse-like relationship between an artist and a sitter is Freud's previously never before seen in public drawing of Lady Caroline Blackwood, Lady Caroline Blackwood, who was his second wife, a woman who he met at a debutante ball and who he felt completely and utterly in love with, and followed around London, Paris, Saint-Tropez, pawning paintings in order to keep up with her lifestyle. And eventually he won her over, and he then promptly went off and took up a mistress, and later on said to a biographer that the exhaustion of pursuing her meant, well, the ardor spent on pursuing her meant that his passion had passed by the time he actually won her, which is sort of sad, but that gave us a very great body of work, because there are numerous portraits of Lady Caroline Blackwood. Where do we go from here, Cassandra? You were going to ask me about...
Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit about photography. So it seems like this is a really strong part of the exhibition, and one that was a little surprising to me. I've seen some other traveling exhibitions that the NPG has done in the past, and those, at least the ones I've seen, haven't included photography, although I know it's a hugely popular part of the collection for visitors today. And I was really struck by the selection of some of the images. So I was wondering if you could tell us, was photography collected by the NPG when it was founded in 1856? And did you and the other curators find that there are certain kinds of love stories that photography tells maybe better than painting, differently than painting?
Absolutely. Well, not absolutely. We didn't collect photography in 1856. We weren't that hip, given that photography had only existed for about 20 years. But our first photographic acquisition was in 1932, when we acquired a portrait of Isabella Beeton, the cookery writer, the Victorian cookery writer. We had taken up something called the National Photographic Record, which are very dour photographic portraits of people in public life, like civil servants and the head of the Metropolitan Police. It's a very useful reference source, but you know, pre-regular photography in everyone's lives, it was a sort of formal process the gallery undertook. But these two photographs are good examples of the types of love stories that photography can record, that painting never could. And that there's an intimacy, but there's an immediacy about photography. On the left, you have a photograph from Cecil Beaton's shoot on the wedding day of Wallis Simpson, formerly Wallis Simpson, the divorcee who married Prince Edward, Duke of Windsor, later to be King Edward VIII, the king who abdicated, because this is the moment snapped by Beaton when the prince came back from taking a phone call. None of his family were at his wedding, and he came back from taking a phone call, and it's clear in hindsight that the changed look on their faces during the course of the shoot, and preceding images out of many from this day are much happier, that they had just learnt that Wallis would never be accorded the HRH title or be ultimately queen. And this, of course, led to Edward's decision to abdicate a few months later. But it's very apposite for where we are now in the British monarchy, with lots of people losing titles and making life decisions based upon a desire, as we'll see in a moment, to get away from photography. On the right, of course, you've got, I'm sorry you had to look at this for so long, John and Yoko. Now, Yoko, of course, is one of the most divisive women in the history of modern Britain, still for some, because she's blamed by many for breaking up the Beatles. But John's devotion to her is absolutely paramount. And this photograph was taken one morning after they had spent all night recording songs together at the very beginning of their relationship. And apparently it wasn't until the sun came up that they finally made love. And sometime during the course of the next day, they did this time-lapse photograph of themselves. And it was the cover image for their first album together, which was called Two Virgins. And apparently in America, the record had to be sold in a brown paper bag. So that was quite telling, but also the immediacy and the privacy. This is a private image. And then they later decided to use it because they were so elated by their relationship together. And possibly one of the most romantic images in the show is Alexei Lubomirski's shot on this one from the engagement of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in 2017. And again, a very interesting segue to our next image, because I was going to say, I mean, we've talked through some of these questions first because we had to decide what images to give you. So I asked Cassandra what struck her about the exhibition and whether any of it chimed particularly with anything she was working on or anything she'd been thinking about in portrait terms. And so I'll switch to your next image, Cassandra, and you can tell us.
Yeah, so I was really, I haven't gone to see the exhibition yet, but I have spent a lot of time with the catalog, and I will be making my way to Worcester. And one of the things that I was really interested in was the section obsessed with the muse, about artists and their muses. And so you can see Romney's portrait of Emma Hamilton on the left. Emma Hamilton you can read about her in the catalog, or there are numerous books about her. But she was sort of a professional muse, and she went and would do these amazing dancing sessions and pose in different costumes. And Romney painted many portraits of her. And then I was flipping through the book and I saw this amazing film still by, now what is the artist's name? Because I do want to give him his credit. Robert Colburn, who's an American artist who I looked up. I had never heard of him before, but he was one of the most famous still photographers in Hollywood. So he would shoot portraits of stars and then also still photographs of them. And so this is a portrait of Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier from a movie called That Hamilton Woman, which you can watch on YouTube tonight for free if you want to. It's not the best print of it, but it's pretty fun to watch. And it's a film where Vivien Leigh stars as Emma Hamilton. And she's shown here with Laurence Olivier, who was her husband, and her lover, who's playing Horatio Nelson, who was one of Emma Hamilton's lovers, her most famous and her last lover. And so I just started thinking about my own love of old movies and film stills from when I was a kid, really, and thinking about that relationship, how love is depicted in something that's, you know, Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier, it's a, you know, a film still, they're acting together, it's a job, but they have this true love for each other at the same time. And just for me, it was really fun to see how this links back to 18th century portraits that I feel so passionately about myself. So I'm very interested in this artist and muse section.
And just to say that Lubomirski consciously used the Hollywood composition of close-up lighting, and he talks about that in his own sort of blog and websites, because he is the favorite photographer for Harry and Meghan at the moment.
It's so interesting too. I know, I love looking at this, and now I'm looking at Harry's coat and seeing it looks very kind of like a military greatcoat or something that he's sort of wrapping her in, you know, anyway, really enjoyable.
Yeah.
We'll just skip very quickly past this because I know we're running out of time, but this is a portrait that I've been working on. But let's go to the last question. Let's go to the last question. So I just wanted to ask you, Lucy, if there are any stories from the exhibition that will carry over into the National Portrait Gallery's reopening and presentation of its collection in 2023.
So just to say that the show will actually be traveling through 24. So nearly all of the works that are in the Worcester version of the show will actually not be on the walls of the National Portrait Gallery when we reopen. So there is at least one further US venue, and then it will be going to Asia. But I just picked out these two images from the early 20th century. The show's not hung chronologically, but these two stories both appear in a section called Portraying Partnership, which in some ways for me, as a person who's been married for 20 odd years, has an elegiac quality to it. I mean, the love stories all begin as they do with fireworks, but here we have two double portraits, one of a heterosexual couple, one of a homosexual couple who could never live openly as gay men. On the left, we have Maynard Keynes, the great economist, and his eventual wife, the Russian ballet dancer, Lydia Lopakova, an extremely surprising match to his friends, particularly as when they met, he was not only a bachelor, but a confirmed homosexual. And she, you know, enchanted him, and together they made something new and different. And I suppose Keynes was part of that early 20th century Bloomsbury set, who were rather like today's world of confident gender fluidity, polyamory, and you know, an ease with representing themselves and their sexual lives in ways that were very unusual for the dominant society that they were in. And on the right, you have what is one of the bravest and boldest portraits in the show. It takes the format of a marriage portrait. On the left, you have the composer Peter Pears with his lifetime partner. They lived together for nearly 50 years. The singer and pianist Benjamin Britten. And you have Britten in green there, leaning gently up against Peter Pears. And if their homosexuality had ever been identified formally and prosecuted, they would have spent a lifetime in prison by this time. So they never talked about their sexual preferences or their life, but they lived together 50 years. And I can't remember which one of them died first, but I know that the one nursed the other through the last illness. So, you know, an incredibly passionate and but quiet love. We should probably pass to Olivia and slip quickly, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just going to put a plug in for the NPG's website, which is amazing. And you can obviously you can search by sitter, and it's so enjoyable. If you any of these figures that you have become interested in while Lucy's talking, if you go type their name in, you'll see for most of them at least a couple of other images, if not many images of them. And so it's just a really it's a fantastic website. So I suggest you do that. But yes, let's turn over to Olivia, because Worcester has done some great things with this exhibition being in February and Valentine's Day, and I want to give her a chance to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Cassandra and Lucy. That was really interesting to hear you talk more about the National Portrait Gallery and the exhibition. It just makes me want to get right back into the gallery and spend some more time with these. One moment while I start my screen share. Right. All right, so like many of our visitors, the curatorial team at the Worcester Art Museum was enchanted by the universal themes of love stories. And we wanted to find a way to explore a thematic collection to the city of Worcester, which is nicknamed the Heart of the Commonwealth, by the way, in the exhibition. As some of you who have lived in Worcester long enough may know, our city was one of the early centers for commercial Valentine production in America, starting in the 1840s and thriving until the Second World War. We realized that this history was the perfect tie-in to show local examples of material culture that touched on themes of courting and romance. Additionally, by including Valentines, we could emphasize correspondence and the handheld object, making a nice emotional link to a work like Harriet Goodhue Hosmer's 1853 bronze cast of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning's clasped hands, which is also on view in Love Stories. The Worcester Art Museum doesn't actually have any Valentines in our collection, but the Worcester Historical Museum, which is just a few streets away from us downtown, has a fantastic archive of this material. So I connected with their director, Bill Wallace, and their librarian, Wendy Essery, and spent the spring of 2021 diving deep into their wonderful Valentine archive. To pick the small amount that would fit in the case that we had available for Love Stories, I focused on a combination of visual interest and artistic uniqueness on the one hand, and on the other, I focused on examples from the main players in the history of Worcester commercial Valentine making. It took me about 3 visits to Worcester Historical to finally pick the 16 Valentines we put on display over 2 rotations for Love Stories. Tonight, I am going to talk about just 3 of them, otherwise we would be here all night. So Worcester native Esther Howland was an incredibly enterprising person. She attended Mount Holyoke College, which was then called Mount Holyoke Women's Seminary, as a young woman, and began making her own Valentines to sell in the late 1840s, after she saw examples of English lace assembled Valentines in the US, possibly through her father's job as a stationer in Worcester, although there are some accounts of one being sent to her by a relative or a friend. There are some conflicting legends and anecdotal evidence about her life, but undoubtedly she was a pioneer in the popularization of Valentine's Day greeting cards in America. Howland Valentines are often called assembled Valentines because they were built from imported and pre-printed materials, often from England and Germany, collaged layers of lace, colorful paper wafers, ribbons, tiny lithographed cutouts of cupids, shepherds, flowers, doves, and more. Howland is also credited with creating lift-up Valentines, which were essentially cards that became 3-dimensional by inserting paper springs in between the layers. She employed a group of women who worked in an assembly line system, one person pasting paper lace, one person inserting the pre-printed messages, one person gilding the lace. That is what really elevated her business from a cottage industry into a highly successful and lucrative venture, eventually earning $100,000 per year, which adjusted for inflation is in the millions. What I love about the example of the assembled Valentine that you see on screen is its cleverness. You can see on the left, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right towards the middle, a tiny round mirror. And when you lift the paper lace, underneath there is a brief motto, which says, "The one I love best," which is referring to the face of the card's recipient that would appear in the mirror while they were holding the card. Howland was known for hiding verses and mottos underneath layers of lace and little hidden paper doors. She thought that putting love messages on the top layer of a Valentine was vulgar. Some of her Valentines even included little interior envelopes where you could place another, even more secret message. So another major player in the history of commercial Valentines in Worcester was the family-run Whitney Valentine Company. They got their start in the mid-1860s, and early examples of their work are assembled Valentines very similar to Howland's. But whereas Esther Howland imported paper lace and lithographs, Whitney became a larger manufacturer in part because they began printing their own designs and on their own press, which sped up their rate of production. Over time, they bought out the stock of a lot of smaller Valentine makers and even Howland's own business in 1880 when she sold it in order to care for her dying father. The Whitney Valentine Company reigned as Worcester's dominant manufacturer of Valentines and other greeting cards until the firm was liquidated in 1942, due in part to wartime paper shortages. At the company's closing, it employed 176 men and women in Worcester. While Whitney Valentines, especially those from the 1920s through the 1940s, look much more the way we would expect a commercial Valentine to look, I think it's fascinating that they still encouraged a handmade aesthetic by selling Valentine kits, where you could glue on layers of lace and add little decals yourself. So on the left here, the one that's labeled number 3, is a base card that Whitney sold. And on the right, the number 4, you can see the same card design again, only this time someone has pasted on paper lace, a little butterfly on top, little flowers to either side. This kind of layering and symmetry is visually very close to what Esther Howland was doing in the 1800s. I find this mix of commercial manufacturing and the homemade tradition to be really interesting, bringing the story full circle, and I had to include this pairing in the case. There's so many more Valentines I could talk about, but I only have a brief time with you all tonight, so I will end it here, and I encourage everyone to stop by the case when you visit the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And thank you, Lucy and Cassandra. That was fabulous. And the exhibition is up through Sunday, March 13th. So please do stop in and see that and the Valentines. And now we would like to open it up for your questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function, or you can type it into the chat and we will direct your questions over to our speakers.
So I have a question. How did the expression of Worcester as heart of the Commonwealth come about? And does it have anything to do with Valentine's Day?
Unfortunately, I do not know. I should have looked that up beforehand. I don't think it has anything to do with Valentine's Day, because I think that nickname was in place before it became a center for commercial Valentine manufacturing. I'm assuming it's because it's in the center of Massachusetts, hence heart of the Commonwealth, as opposed to Boston being on the coast. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else from Worcester knows.
It would be wonderful if the person who created that concept could be recognized somehow. And maybe this is a little bit of detective work that would be fun to do.
Of course.
And we have a question in the chat that someone saw the exhibition today and is wondering if you can say more about Dora Carrington's work.
So, Dora Carrington was one of the peripheral members of the Bloomsbury Circle. As you saw in the show, she worked in oils and in drawing. She's reasonably prolific, and she I mean, I know most about her as a person. I'm not a 20th century specialist, so I probably am not best placed to, talk about her in the round. But I know that she is appreciated by feminist scholars and critics, and she's of interest to modern audiences because she, like a number of the members of that social and somewhat aristocratic crowd, and she was not an aristocrat, so she's kind of in there for her own, if you like, merits and sociability and conversational skills and interests, rather than just being one of the crowd who knew each other from childhood. She is somebody who is gender fluid, and a number of her portrait subjects are people who were her lovers. And in the show, we've got a drawing of Mark Gertler, and also this wonderful painting that I showed you at the beginning of Lytton Strachey lying back in bed, reading his book. And what's amazing about this is a very daring composition is when you realize it's got a rather skewed perspective and you can't quite work it out, you eventually realize you are lying in bed next to him. The artist was looking up askance. And so almost like the David Beckham film portrait by Sam Taylor Wood, you're actually being invited to be a voyeur, to get into bed, if you like, and to take up the lover's, neighboring position. And that's quite exceptional at that time. So really, she's quite innovative. I don't know if, Cassandra, you've ever worked with Dora Carrington, perhaps at Yale.
I haven't. Because I did used to be a curator at the Yale Center for British Art, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't know if we had work by her. I don't think we had a painting by her. We might, which is what I specialize in. We might have had drawings, but the Lytton Strachey portrait is so amazing also because when you go and look at it, it's oil on panel. It's so meticulously done, and the way that she's created his skin and the beard, it's really a beautiful work of art. And she seems to have a really unique artistic touch, to me, at least in that piece. Some of the other Bloomsbury things are kind of more blocky, but this is a huge amount of very beautiful detail and using the panel to allow herself to get that kind of detail. So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for our speakers tonight? We have one here from Elena. What was the selection process for these particular pieces for the National Portrait Gallery traveling exhibition? In other words, did you use some specific criteria for inclusion of certain pieces of art into this exhibit?
So, of course, there's a kind of intellectual question that we began with, which is, what do portraits tell us about love? And what does love have to do with the production of portraiture? And so we chose works from the collection which either pointed to particular love stories, and we arranged the love stories thematically. So I mentioned portraying partnership, but there's also the trials of love, and in which you've got the portrait of Oscar Wilde and his lover, Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas. So that's a tragic love story. Or we have love and creativity. We look at love in the artist's studio when artists get together. So we had the criteria, the thematic structure came out of the stories that emerged from the collection, but the selection criteria was portraits that had love as their principal kind of production purpose, or which pointed to a particular love story. So we have a wonderful double portrait, a sort of abstract double portrait of Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson, two early modernist British artists. Barbara Hepworth, the great abstract sculptor, Ben Nicholson, one of the leaders of British modernism. And that's a wonderful, partly representative figurative painting, partly abstract. So, you get to see a lot of different art forms, a lot of different works of art. You learn and discover lots of different personal stories. real life love stories, as I've mentioned, but also you get to see how love plays out through art over a 500-year period.
Thank you. Any other questions for our panelists? Don, I see you.
I found the story of Lord Nelson fascinating. Could you comment on that?
It's a well-known story, but he in fact, films have been being made about it since the 1950s. Nelson was not the first man to be completely beguiled by Emma Hamilton. Emma, Lady Hamilton, well, she wasn't quite Lady Hamilton, but she was married to Lord Hamilton, or about to be married to Lord Hamilton, sorry. She comes back to Britain with Nelson and Hamilton. But what's interesting is, so now she meets Nelson whilst she and her partner, Lord William Hamilton, are living in Naples. He is the British ambassador to Naples. Emma has been sent to stay with him by her former lover, who was trying to get rid of her, basically, which is a kind of sad element to the story. But she, as she always does in an incredibly artful and entrepreneurial way, makes good of the situation. And Hamilton falls in love with Emma very quickly. She grows fond of him. He's much, much older than her. He's an intellectual. She's a very voluptuous, physical sort of person. But she meets Nelson as Nelson is coming back to shore after the Battle of the Nile, and he is physically wounded, depleted, and Emma climbs on board. You know, there's a welcoming party with the King and Queen of Naples, as well as to have the two Hamiltons, and she climbs on board, and apparently she says, "Oh my God, is this real?" and faints into Nelson's arms. So she's good at histrionics right from her first days posing for George Romney, the artist who paints her more than any other artist, and we have a portrait of him in the show. And Nelson falls profoundly and deeply in love with Emma because, in part, she nurses him. The Hamiltons take him into their house as a guest, and he recuperates there. But then the unthinkable, he what's the right military term? He lets go of his post. He refuses to return to his ship for the next mission because he is so completely besotted by Emma. So he is Britain's greatest hero, and he's also facing a challenge of insubordination because of his love for this woman. And eventually all three of them, they live in a menage a trois because neither Hamilton nor Nelson can give her up. So she's got some sex appeal, and they come back to England and live together as a threesome. And Emma marries, this blacksmith's daughter marries Lord Hamilton and becomes Lady Hamilton, but she's actually in a profound love affair with Nelson, who tries to divorce his wife in order to live with Emma, and eventually the wife dies. It's not a great story for the wife, I'm afraid.
But when you go to the National,
and
when you go to the National Portrait Gallery and you just go out of the building, turn the corner, you can see Nelson on his column standing in Trafalgar Square, this, amazing statue of him way up high. And it is fascinating to think about him as a person in a menage a trois and a deserter. And yet he, as you said, he's the greatest hero in British history in some ways. So fascinating.
He did return to his command after a while, but because of course he still has to go fight the Battle of Trafalgar. Yes, thank you. That's and there's a great deal written on them at every level of consumption, but it is a fabulous story.
Thank you. You have another question here. Some of the works were commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery. They want to know, how are these decisions made and how does this process work?
That's a very good question. The National Portrait Gallery is the largest institutional patron of contemporary arts in Britain. We don't always succeed, to commission about 6 portraits a year. The decisions about who we commission, whose portraits come into the collection through that process, are the decision of the trustees. And every year, our contemporary curator and the director present a curated list of potential people that we might need for the collection, who might meet the trustees' criterion of what it means to contribute to British history and culture, and Britain's present day life, of course, if you're a living sitter. And we've only been doing this for about 30 or 35 years. But we have a really wonderful collection of photographs and other artworks that have been commissioned. Some of them point to love stories, most of them, of course, don't, and it's incidental. People don't come into the collection because they're fantastically important as a lover, I'm afraid. That's usually incidental and a second tier of knowledge about them. It's great to be a lover, but it's generally not considered your public life.
And you're getting a question, Lucy, if you can speak about the lost portrait of Emma Hamilton by Richard Westall that was recently found at a seaside antique store.
I haven't even heard of it. Do send me the details.
I haven't either. This is very interesting.
Another question, could you talk about the photo of Paul and Linda McCartney that they saw in promotional material?
Well, I think that is a portrait taken in the mid-70s when they were married. They were a couple who, as you all know, lived an extremely happy and reasonably long married life together, cut short by Linda's early illness. And it's a domestic, portraying partnership image. They're sitting on a sofa. There's not much to say. Can I remember who? I've got the book by me. I will just check who the photographer was. It's not one I have.
No, I was just looking, but I can't
embedded. I'm not sure it's in the book, actually.
I don't think it is.
No, it's a great image, but it's possibly not one of the absolute standouts of the show, which is why it didn't make it into the book.
It's interesting though that the how visually, I guess this is very obvious, but just how visually astute the Beatles were in all of their many phases. It's interesting. Right.
That's true. And you asked a question, Cassandra, earlier about are there certain love stories and moments in love stories that could only be expressed photographically. We have the most amazing private image by Lichfield again, Lord Lichfield, of Mick Jagger in the wedding car after coming out of the registry office with a very gorgeous Bianca Jagger. And the life of hedonism. I think he's got a joint in his hand and a bottle of champagne between his legs. Yeah, and and a very colourful shirt on, it being 1971. So you really get, and he too, has kept up his pace of hedonism. So he's a very much well represented in our collection. It's a modern hero.
Well, thank you so much. We are going to respect time here for Lucy. It is in the middle of the night now in London. So we really look forward to seeing you all. The exhibition is open until Sunday, March 13th is the last day. We do have tours of it going regularly from our docents, Fridays at 1 p.m., Saturdays and Sundays at 2 p.m. You can get a guided tour of the Love Stories exhibition. And then we will have a Zip Zoom discussion on Wednesday, February 23rd with our docent that will be focused on the portraits of the Brownings and their hand cast. So if you'd like to join us for that, you can get the link online. I'd like to thank you, Lucy, for joining us. It's so great to have you with us, and we appreciate you staying up late. And thank you, Cassandra, for being in conversation. It's great to have you as well, and Olivia. So thank you all for joining us, and have a good night and come see the show.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye. Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
It was great.